Hello, my name is Raynor. I'm the Director of Business Advising here at CEI. CEI helps entrepreneurs in Maine start and grow their business. We offer informative workshops and interactive multi-session peer groups available live on Zoom or in person, in addition to one-on-one business advising. For more information about CEI, please visit our website, ceimaine.org. Today, I'm going to be talking about pricing. I'm going to break it into two different parts and record two separate sessions. The first section, which is we're going to dig into right now, is covering internal pricing models. So kind of establishing a floor of pricing for your business so you understand what you need to charge to at least reach a level of break even. The second part of this series is going to be looking at external pricing, which is really that connection between your value proposition, your marketing communication, and pushing the ceiling of your pricing model and what you can kind of get away with. So that'll be what we cover, the internal floor pricing. What does it cost me to create? How can I charge enough to stay in business and still be here a month from now, a year from now? And that value proposition, how do I communicate the value that I'm creating effectively with my clients so that I can raise that price based on the demand that I have received? And where do I fit when I look at my competitors? So let's start with the internal approach. What do I need to charge for my product or service to remain in business, to still be here, right? So the term that gets thrown around a lot is COGS, which stands for cost of goods sold, or direct costs, which is essentially the cost of creation. So when you think about your service or your product, think about the materials, the labor. If you are a restaurant or in a food business, what are the ingredients that go into that recipe? And what other costs do you equate directly with creation? Some people consider the swiping of a credit card as a direct cost because that service charges you around 3% every time you swipe. Or some of my manufacturing clients consider electricity or utilities as part of that because they're very utility intensive. And so as their sales grow, so does that cost. And that's a great indicator of what a direct cost is. If you sell more, you have to spend more. If you sell less, you have to spend less. So what are those costs that go up and down with your sales? So as you think about that product that you're creating, maybe you have a couple different SKUs, a couple different options. How do you purchase those ingredients or those materials? How many do you use? So do you purchase a 50-pound bag of flour and you use half a cup for a recipe? And what is the equivalence of that? How much time does it take you, as you're looking at that labor cost associated with generating the product? Measure that time, measure those phases. Step one takes this amount of time. Step two takes this amount of time. What is my expectation of myself or, a group of employees to produce that unit? Do I have any waste or inconsistency? These are all things to be thinking about, right? If you're in the food business, a restaurant or food production, there's a great book called The Book of Yields, which I highly recommend. This is not product placement, but what the Book of Yields does is says, okay, you buy a 50-pound bag of potatoes. How many usable pounds do you get out of that? What's a good conversion rate or estimate that if you're putting 8 ounces of mashed potato on a plate, how much does that 8 ounce actually cost you? It's not a direct conversion because there's some waste as you peel those potatoes and so on, right? So that conversion is a great way to kind of think about that waste and control that. I had a restaurant client a couple years ago that had 2 sous chefs, and they were tasked with the same, product creation. And they had a little competition where each sous chef had a trash can next to their station for food waste. And at the end of the night, they would measure the trash can and determine who had the least food waste, who was the most productive and most efficient, converter of food. So just a fun little way that you can start measuring those things and then hold your team accountable or create, kind of a gamified situation in which you can encourage more efficient production. So once you start thinking about that and jotting that down and saying, okay, this is about what it cost me to create, this is my recipe. This is one I did a while back. You can see, you have your recipe of purchases. These are all the ingredients and what they cost me to purchase per unit. And then I have my recipe per batch on the right side, which is, okay, how many of these units that I have purchased go into this recipe? So that gives me a single batch price of all of my ingredients. And this takes a little work, but it's very useful, especially if there's change in the market, right? A couple years ago, vanilla, quadrupled in price in a couple months, and we were using this to say, okay, what does our price need to be to kind of absorb that change in our cost, right? So this total ingredient cost per batch, in this example, this is made up, I've changed a lot of it, but in this example, it's $210 of ingredients that I now have mixed together or created. And that produces about 1,200 units. I think this was chocolates or something, right? So I have 1,200 chocolates. I have a waste or spillage consideration. It is not one-to-one. Some of those things go missing. Some of them get eaten off the assembly line, whatever it is, dropped. And so it's caramels, right? So what is my caramels per box? And I put, so with that waste consideration, I end up with a little over 1,000 created caramels that are there. I box them in groups of 12, and I can produce 90 boxes with this batch. So my ingredient cost per box is $2.34. That is what I have to charge for that box of caramels to at least cover the cost of ingredients, to not lose money on the ingredients cost. Then the second section down below is this idea of labor and production. Now you'll notice that this is not salaries. This is not considering, okay, they're there 40 hours a week. It is just saying, what do I need to charge if my employees are working full time, right? On this production, and every moment that they're in there, they are working on creating a box of caramels, right? So in this case, I paid one employee, looks like $25 an hour, so probably a manager of some kind, and they have some time invested. They check in, they do some quality controls, but it's primarily the second, floor employee that I pay a little bit less, and their time is in the creation of this product. So, you can see the wage, time of minutes. Again, this is a rough math. This isn't including payroll taxes or benefits or overhead or anything associated. It's just saying, what does it cost me to create? And that gives me, okay, it takes about $66 in labor cost to go through a batch. And I'm thinking start to finish, and measuring out the ingredients, creating, baking, whatever it is, boxing, finishing. So $66 in labor, same number of boxes produced. That's important, right? Because we're looking at the totality of a single batch, start to finish. And that gives me a labor cost of 74 cents per box, right? $66 divided by 90 boxes. And then I have per box, materials cost, which is the ribbon, the little saran wrap, the box itself. Maybe it's an ice box. And that leaves me with, when I have a finished product box sitting there on the counter, ready to be sold, I know exactly what that cost me in materials, packaging, and labor, my direct costs for this particular example of $4.82. Now, a lot of people stop listening after, about 5 minutes ago, because they say, well, what if I'm service-based? I'm an electrician, or I'm a plumber, or a service provider. I do website development. None of this matters, right? I don't have any tangible markups. Maybe if I'm a plumber or an electrician or, a similar contractor specialist, I charge, for materials plus 10% or something, but it's really a service-based thing. So the margin, the gross profit margin that we're going to talk about calculating, and your cost is just that cost of labor. What does it cost me to show up and provide this service? Now, a lot of entrepreneurs, especially when you're starting out and considering how you set your pricing, your instinct is to say, I'll do anything, right? I don't need to get paid right now. I just need to get my name out there. I need to get some work. That is short-lived, and especially if you have recurring clients, you're setting an expectation. right? And that expectation is that you are the cheapest in the market. The second part of this series on pricing talks about expectation setting and how to price yourself, in the market and where your value proposition is. But setting that expectation and then having to raise your prices is setting the client up for disappointment. So if you set that bar a little bit higher at the forefront, what I like to say is make yourself replaceable. The goal is to add clients and build your business. At some point, you might consider bringing somebody in, and you want to do so at least the same level that you would be paying yourself. So when we're talking about pricing and establishing a price for yourself and your business as a service-based model, charge as if you were hiring yourself. What do you need to get paid for that hour? And that is the bare minimum assumption of labor cost. Do you actually need to pay yourself that? That's up to you, but you need to put yourself in a position to pay yourself for the work that you are doing or to pay somebody else, right? So what we do with that is we then determine what's called our gross profit. And our gross profit is what we charge versus what it cost us, right? At that $4.82 per box of caramels, if I charge $4.82, I can do $1 billion in sales and I will lose money because everything that I make, I have to spend to replace my inventory, right? So I have zero gross profit in that example. My cost is exactly what my price is. The second we take a step above that, we create what's called gross profit. I charge $5 on that $4.82, and now I have 18 cents of gross profit. If I sell $1 of materials, I keep 18 cents. If I sell $1 of caramels, I keep 18 cents, right? If my labor cost, my assumed labor cost for the work is $17 an hour, and I charge $30 an hour for doing the work, I have a gross profit margin of $13, right? So that gross profit, we can either determine after we set our pricing, or we can use it to determine what our pricing should be. So you can go out in the market and you can look at different industry resources. And again, if you have questions on that, please reach out. We have access to some information we can provide to you. And we can say, okay, the average, I don't know, chocolatier or the average restaurants are good examples. Pretty easy rule of thumb is the cost of ingredients on a plate of food on a menu item is usually between 30 and 35% of the sale price. So we know the gross profit is, 65 to 70%. Labor is another 30 to 35% for restaurants. So that's all the labor in a restaurant, and the ingredients means that your cost of goods, your direct cost is usually around 70% and your gross profit margin is 30%. And so if we know what our profit margin should be or could be, we can reverse that and figure out what our price needs to be. If my total box of caramel cost is $4.82 and I want my gross profit margin to be 60%, all I do is divide that, by the margin. And we say, okay, my unit cost divided by 0.6 gets me to a target price of $12.06. Now, do I ever walk into a retail store and see a box of food, marked at $12.06? No. So I'd probably round up to, $12.49 or $12.99, right? And give myself a little bit of buffer because your prices, your costs are always going to go up a little bit. So do the math, figure out what it needs to be, round up. And this gets us to the point of break even and starting to look at our business with a break even analysis, right? And this is the idea of what do I need to charge to cover my overhead and still be here? So this is a great, I'll get to it, but I call it the post-it note number, where you say, this is everything I need to know in a single number, and either I'm winning or I'm losing, right? So you can figure it out, the relationship between your price and your cost is your gross profit. I love looking at the gross profit of a business because that's everything about what you're trying to do. That's everything about your value. It's how much more somebody is willing to pay you above the cost of creation. So that difference is how well you communicate your expertise, your proprietary knowledge, your value, your quality, your uniqueness, right? And again, we'll get into that in the second part, but for now, it's very important to know that number and know what you want that number to be. The other portion of your expenses, so we've talked a lot about those direct costs, which go up and down with your sales, right? Are your fixed costs are indirect, right? And those stay the same. If I don't sell anything, I still have to pay rent. I still have to pay insurance. I still have to pay, well, maybe I don't have to pay my bookkeeper because I don't have anything to enter, but I have to cover these costs whether or not I'm doing well or poorly in my business, right? So this is kind of that monkey on my back, right? The 90,000 a year that I have to come up with to still be here. Now, the joy of knowing that number is that if my gross profit is 60%, I've assigned my price where it needs to be to cover that 482 and give myself, a higher margin, then I know my overhead costs. And so every dollar I sell, I keep 60 cents, right? My profit margin 60%. I keep 60 cents of every dollar I sell to cover $91,000. Well, what do my sales need to be? To get to my sales goal, all I have to do is take that 91,000, divide by 0.6, and now I have a sales goal. If I sell $152,400 in whatever that I'm doing, I know 40% of that is going to cover the cost of creation, to cover the cost of ingredients and labor and materials, and $91,000 is going to fall to the bottom line to cover my overhead. Well, that doesn't leave me with much, right? But that's the purpose of a break even, is to get to zero, to get to at least zero. I don't want to lose money anymore. I don't want this to be a hobby. I want this to be a business. What does my number need to be at the top line to cover everything to the bottom? This is where the fun part is, right? Where I say, okay, that's great to talk about a whole year. What about now? What about this week? Well, if I know my goal is 152,000 and my unit that I'm selling, my product, my service, whatever it is, I charge $50 per unit, per customer, per ticket. Well, to get to that number, I have to do 59 units sold a week. I'm open 6 days a week. That's 10 a day, right? I can back into it easily. That's the post-it number, right? At the end of every day, I can say, did I sell 10 or not? Am I covering my costs or am I losing money, right? And am I happy with this? Is this reasonable? Do I think I can get out there? And, the marketing plan is an effort to communicate that value to the people who want to hear it so that you have those people coming in the door. You have those sales occurring, right? Now, your break-even point, right? Your whole business is about that functionality, that connection between these three pieces to say, I need enough sales to cover the cost of creation and cover my overhead, right? My selling enough at a high enough margin, good enough price point to have something left over for myself at the end of the day. And pricing is the only real lever to pull, right? To say, okay, if I sell X, that's my expectation, do I have enough margin to cover my overhead, or do I need to increase my price? Conversely, if I reduce my price, I need to sell more to get to the same overhead, right? I have a couple case studies in here. This one was a client a while back that was selling a wooden toy on Etsy for about $45. And I think the cost of creation was around 25. So their profit was $20 per unit, right? Their first quarter, I wrote this in the first person for some reason, but their first quarter, they sold 250 units, pretty good for a starting business. And they made a little over $11,000. And then they had, a chamber event. They were approached by a marketing firm that offered to increase sales by 25% if they agreed to reduce their price by 10%. They said, hey, if you market a little lower, you'll sell a bunch more. And the question was, is this a good deal? Is this worthwhile, right? Increased sales, lower margin. And the catch is that the margin is lower, right? So in this example, they had sold 250 at a 25% increase. That gets them up to 313 units. But their cost of goods, their cost of creation was exactly the same. It was still that $25 per unit. So their profit went from $20 to 16, or from 44 cents of every dollar to 38 cents of every dollar. So they lost profit. And their gross profit on those 250 units was $5,000, and their gross profit on the 313 units was $4,800 for a. So they lost money doing more work. So that gut that you might have where, hey, more sales are better, depends, right? You have to do the full workload. So same client, taking it one step further, right? What if they raised their price to $49.99, from $45 to $49.99? But their concern is, well, I'm going to lose some people. They're going to go find their toy elsewhere. They're going to go to Walmart or Toys R Us or just find another product on Etsy. So they're going to lose customers when they raise their price. And this is a very common concern in Maine. And a lot of people really like sticking to their original price. Well, if they increase their price by $5, their profit margin goes up substantially because the costs are still the same, right? So even if they lose 15% of their clients, going from 250 down to 212, 215, look at what their profit margin does. The actual money that they have to put toward their overhead. They went from $5,000 to $5,300. So this is the opposite scenario of the first example, right? Where they're doing less work for more money, right? It's pretty nice, right? If you can get away with it. And that's always the question is, do you know what you're expecting? Does it still make sense? And then how do you measure it in a timely manner? Right? If you raise your price by $5 and you lose 30% of your customers, are you waiting till the end of the year to do that math? Or are you able to react quickly enough and say, okay, I got to back off of my pricing? So that's the risk you run by not doing the math. Is sometimes your gut lies to you, right? That instinct of saying, my customers would never accept the $5 price increase. Well, have you tried it? Or, on the first example, yeah, I'd love, if I just reduce my price a little bit, I can increase my customers by 25%. Yeah, let's go for it. Well, hold on, do the math and understand that relationship between your price and your cost, because that will get you to that floor, right? We talk about break even, we talk about understanding. This number becomes so important, right? If I only think I can sell 5 units a day, well, my profit needs to be twice as much. And where does my price there? And does this make sense at that point? So if we're doing the math, if we understand the cost of creation and the cost of our margin and the cost to stay in business, then we can connect those dots and establish a necessary price for us to move forward. It's also very useful with that distinction between wholesale and retail. If you're in, micro manufacturing, or you're just starting out and you're thinking about grabbing a couple wholesale accounts, you can give away some profit margin and still be profitable. But how much more work do you have to do to recover that, right? So a lot of businesses have both wholesale and retail. And the retail is where they really make their money. And the wholesale is just a way to get their name out there and get in front of more customers. So how are you combining those things and managing those two sets of expectations? So that is internal pricing, using your costs to determine an appropriate price so that you can understand the minimum amount to charge to stay in business. Come back for part 2 when we talk about raising the ceiling. What can I get away with in increasing my price, and how do I justify that to a customer?